Welcome to another episode of Curious. I'm your host, Sharon Latimer Mosley. On today's show, we have a conversation with educator, public speaker, and the co-CEO of Archie Comics, Nancy Silberkleit. Welcome, Nancy.
Well, Sharon, I always like to give the host and their audience a zam, wham, wow. So zam, wham, wow to your audience for having me here today in Mamaroneck.
We're so happy to have you, Nancy, and thank you for stopping by. Could you tell me about your husband? Now, how did you become the co-CEO of Archie Comics?
That needs a speech bubble saying, yikes. My husband's father, Louis Silberkleit, had a partner, John Goldwater, and those two gentlemen went into the publishing business and had this idea of putting teenagers in a school setting, creating a little bit of conflict, and letting them work it out without any adult intervention, but also adding in what was happening in that decade. Well, those two gentlemen went on to have children, and John Goldwater's son was Richard, and Louis' son was Michael, my husband. So it was Richard and Michael that carried the business into second generation. And it was about 10 and a half years ago, or maybe 11 years ago, it's going up there in time, that those gentlemen passed away within 7 months of one another with no succession plan. So I am actually propelling the company with the other side family, my partner John B. Goldwater, into third generation. But I am the first female executive to ever walk through Archie Comics' door, the first female executive to ever walk through their door.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that. You came to Archie as an art educator, is that correct?
Yes.
And you had no business experience whatsoever, right?
Well.
And I just want you to tell me, what was your first day like? Do you remember?
Absolutely, but even before that, when I stepped out of the classroom into the Archie boardroom, I thought at that time I had no business experience. At that time, I thought that Archie rainbow was way beyond my head. But now, when I look back 10 years, I see I was overqualified because for just not me, but for teachers, it is our responsibility to get information to individual minds in a way they can grasp what we are pitching. The same for the person in the business seat. It is their responsibility to connect the brand to the people. So what better person can do that than your teacher? I remember I was the art teacher, so I wasn't just seeing, 25 students a year. I was seeing the entire student body. And a teacher will go out of their way not only to understand the mind of their students, but to understand their family. So I met a lot of personalities, a lot of people in the 25 years of teaching that I had under my belt. And also, I was an art teacher. And an art teacher just seems to be wired with creativity. So coming into Archie Comics, it was always ideas coming out from my box, and it also enabled me to start a foundation because my ideas were always leading to be educational teaching. I thought, well, I can't keep always doing this in Archie. And for example, can I show you one of my very first ideas? It was on environment. I had asked one of our talented writers to create a story about environment, and they came up with one called called Bottle Battle. And that went over so well. I had another writer, and sadly, one of our great writers, Batten Lash, we just lost him about a few weeks ago. Yes, he's very young, and he died too young. So he was in his 60s. He was my age. But I cherish the story he gave Archie Comics, and it's called Getting Drastic with Plastic. So, here was the art teacher's idea to put in stories that had an edge for learning. But then I wanted to up it a notch, like Emerald on the cooking show. Wanted to put in some spice into it. And I decided that this particular story needed a teacher's study guide to help teachers maneuver the best, to get out the most they can in the panels. So I had hired someone who gave me a wonderful teaching guide for getting drastic with plastic. So the teachers, as they're teaching that lesson, are guided on what panels they can spark a lot of conversation on. And then after that, going further, in my travels, I go around the world into schools and into libraries, always pitching Archie Comics in the classroom. I came up with the need for some stories to be in Braille, if all of our stories could be in Braille. But here is Getting Drastic with Plastic in Braille.
Let me interrupt you there. So let's step back a bit. What is the process for creating a comic? So you had this great idea, and how is it received at Archie Comics? Is it an open place where you sit in the office and these creative ideas go back and forth, or is it just an idea and then the artist interprets the ideal you want? What is the process? What happens?
Well, like anything, no one can do anything on their own. And of course, you need support, because to write in graphic literacy, that's not me. I'm not skilled in that. So I really rely on our team to be, working together, to be collaborative, to bring out these stories that have gone on. We're almost 80 years old. So the way it starts, always an idea like a conductor, and then, giving that idea to our editor, our wonderful editor. He's been there, I think, about 65 years,
Wow.
Victor Gorelick. So it's, Victor and sometimes myself that will pull the best writer that would be suitable for this story. We have writers that we would say, gosh, we'll have him do the Jughead stories, or we'll have them do the Archie stories, or the Kevin Keller stories. So we, talk about it. So after you have the idea, then you have your writer, then you need your penciler. And these are all careers. I love going into schools talking about career awareness, about all the parts that go in to making the whole. So then after you have the editor, the writer, the penciler, then you need the inker. And the inker starts making the panels look like a coloring book.
Now, has this changed over time? Because now everything is computerized, and even comic books are digital. So is that the same, or has that changed?
Well, you're very astute, because that's what I bring out when I go into schools and speak. I said some of the careers I am talking about are obsolete. You do not want to go into them. I just had a new story done with our new character, Scarlet Saltee, and I had it inked by an inker. But very rare to find an inker these days, because
and what's an inker?
An inker is a person who's in a career that outlines the pencils. But you touched upon technology. Technology, the computers are making these jobs look obsolete. So some of the careers I'm mentioning would be obsolete because of technology and the computer, especially the colorists. Things can be done, computerized. So there are many parts. So when I come into Archie, it's just not me that's doing this. You need a lot of people to make such a wonderful product.
So tell me about what is the demographic of Archie Comics now? Has it changed? I think I remember reading it at 11 or something like that. What is your target audience now?
Well, when Archie Comics started about 80 years ago, these two men, I wish they could be here today, because they have given not just the United States, but the globe a gift. They saw that the comic book industry, this type of literacy was geared for the male population. It was,
I see that from
bam, wham, zam.
But it's also, I was reading in one of the books that's available at the library that it kind of started out, pre-war, before one of the wars, and so they did pulp fiction, and so they had a lot of military military themes and pinup girls, and so that kind of followed the comic through to Archie, did it not?
Well, they saw that there was a great need to put out a product that would be geared for the female. And I would say right when I came in, there was a huge surge in the female population visiting comic book stores. And the comic book stores, they are phenomenal. They make it very welcoming for like families, for everyone to be there. So Archie Comics, that was their intent, but they couldn't keep it that way. It became so loved by both genders. And it's genderless, it's timeless, and it's ageless. And especially now, it's absolutely has gone in so many directions. We have a new show called Riverdale, and I am meeting people that are in their 70s, 75, 76, saying, I have to share a story. I was walking down to the basement, and I knew my grandchildren were down watching TV with something called Riverdale, and I heard it was different from the classic Riverdale that I know, Archie Comics, but I wanted to be cool and join them. So I just was going to, sit down and be cool. And they are hooked to the show.
Well, I watched it myself, and it's a little dark. It's almost, it's to me the characters are the dark side of the characters. Like Veronica's father is a mobster, and Jughead is the school editor. And I always thought of Jughead as someone who was quiet and passive type of character, and so it's a little. I was a little shocked, to be honest with you.
Well, the people who have grown up with Archie, know the brand so well. This is a brand that has touched their hearts, and they've kept it in their hearts and carried it through their lifetime. So, of course, when you see this on the screen as the dark side, but you mentioned something about how Jughead's father was into drugs or alcohol, was doing time. But as I said, Archie Comics, so I think before the show we were talking about it, Archie Comics has a formula, and it is putting kids in a high school, creating conflict, but letting the kids work it out. And that's exactly what they're doing on Riverdale. But it's the outside forces, the decade that is bringing in what is happening, like in real time. It's, part of this era.
It seems kind of for 20-somethings. Some of the themes seem a little older to me. Not that I'm saying it's not a great show. It is a great show. And in fact, one of my coworkers watches it religiously, Stefan. My daughter watches it. My two daughters watch it. And my husband watches. I didn't know until I came to interview you, and I sat down with them, and I was like, Riverdale, is this, the Archie Riverdale? And I was like, this is not the Archie I grew up with. Well, but it's an excellent storyline.
Yeah, but when you say the 20-year-old, when I look at the shows, I look at it, it's a show that is just phenomenal for sparking conversation on topics that we do not want our young teens getting into. There was a segment on drugs, and you saw exactly what peer pressure is at a party. This was giving you an insight to exactly what happens when your teen goes to a party. So it's a perfect show to bring up that conversation, because if you're going to say, hey, let's sit down and talk about drugs, they're going to go upstairs. But if you're sitting down in front of this TV, you can comfortably bring up that topic. And that leads me into what I wanted to bring to your audience today. I've created a new character called Scarlet, and her last name is Saltee, Scarlet Saltee.
But before we get to that, we should also mention that you're going to be at the Mamaroneck Library, correct, talking about Riverdale, February 20th?
Yes,
Yeah,
I think at 4 o'clock I will be there.
Yes.
And, you know, the Mamaroneck Library, it's like almost going into, you know, our office. They have all the books on their shelves. They really have embraced Archie Comics. Oh, you got those from the Mamaroneck Library?
Yes, these are all from at the library.
Yes, well, the teen librarian there, Ellen, she has done a phenomenal
Ellen
job.
McIntyre.
And it's really the young people of her community that have sparked the desire to have those books on the shelves. And I was in, I think, Alabama. I've been so many places where the teens are really driving their librarian to stock those shelves with those books.
That's another question I want to ask you. How many countries is Archie in?
We're global, so there's not a country we are not in. And even surprisingly, we're in countries where, you know, they do not share our type of dating style.
In our culture, like how does that translate? How does a culture, because this is American culture, how does that translate into another culture?
Well, I am told they like to have insight into American culture. And some of our stories have been translated into their language, but they did not do so well because the people demand to have that fresh American culture. Someone told me they learned about Jalopy only reading in Archie Comics. Jalopy is not in their culture, but they remember Jalopy was only from reading Archie Comics. So it translates to the desire and the inquisitiveness of what American culture is like.
So you're
it's
not
very
really
well
changing the story, you're just changing the language.
Yes.
Ah, I see.
Well, sometimes we have it in Spanish or French American, but I have found with feedback from people around the world, they want to read it in English, and that's how they learn their English.
Well, that makes sense.
Yes.
So you have a new mission. I don't know if it's a new mission of inclusion, and you were just about to tell us about Scarlet Saltee, who has autism. So what was the inspiration for this comic?
Well, coming from the classroom and also coming from where I taught in Paramus, we had an autistic population, and I was their art teacher. So I can remember many situations where I could tell that behind their, you know, shell, being quiet, maybe a little bit withdrawal, that they desired friendships. They wanted to be part of the class. So inclusion is very much in my heart. And of course, inclusion for anyone, for everybody, has always been on my mind. So I thought this was a wonderful opportunity to introduce, not just saying autistic, but to introduce a teen in the high school, in Riverdale High, who is very skilled. Scarlett's very skilled in building. And as her intellectual property grows, she's also skilled in building ideas. But Scarlett is very deeply invested in wanting to find a way to have friends. She desires friendship, but her social cues make that very, very difficult for her because she is autistic. And I want people to be able to have that constructive conversation in being aware that everyone has to be included, but how do we reach out to a person who is autistic? So to, you know, again, are you going to have that conversation in a meaningful way in a classroom?
So how did you introduce her into Riverdale, into the school? Because she was already there, was she not? or was
well,
she a new student?
Well, you know, when you say that, I'm sure many students in Riverdale are autistic, but it just was never talked about, or a story never attached to a person who is autistic. So I thought coming up with a story and introducing Scarlett in a story called Kindness Works. And again, it's how do we approach the conversation? As a teacher, engagement is key. To teach anything is engagement. How is the teacher going to do that? So I felt creating a comic book story would be, you know, an ideal way of then having the conversation. You know, class, I came across, I'm a big Archie fan. Anybody know Archie? Oh, you heard about Riverdale? Well, here's something called the classic Archie, and I have a comic book story. Let's read it. And that's when the conversation can happen. So not only are you having a literary lesson, because our Common Core standards require that every English teacher introduce graphic literacy. So here you are introducing a literary lesson, but you're bringing in a social lesson. You're teaching the whole child. And as we know, bullying, exclusion is out. We don't do that. And it's our young people that are creating the culture on kindness.
How do you create a character and put a character in a story like that without it feeling that you just put it in? You know, that you're just trying to teach a lesson. So how did you introduce her into Riverdale, into the idea of the story? How did Veronica react to her? Because I would think Veronica would act a certain way towards her.
Well, Betty, who did not come, and you requested to have Betty, but
Betty's everybody.
But again, you know, it's the parts that make the whole. And it was my talented writer that put Scarlett on a school bus. His name's Ray Felix, and he saw Scarlett at a school that she was feeling very comfortable at and included in. But unfortunately, what happens today, some schools shut down, and Scarlett's school shut down, and she was being sent to Riverdale. So here she comes to Riverdale, and Veronica is very open to helping Scarlett, but it ended up, they had a connection. They had met when they were in preschool, and Archie remembered Scarlett that he says she must have be building skyscrapers by now, because she was very astute building with building blocks. So there was a connection. So they gently brought her into the Riverdale family, the writer.
Do you plan on doing other stories where it's not so easy? That seems very easy, and it's not always that easy.
Well, I think I would like to bring out more panels where Scarlett is, you know, struggling with her social cues. Now,
that's for some children, that's an everyday struggle.
Yes.
So, and it's also a struggle for acceptance every day. So I was wondering if, you know, do you expect to show her in those situations and how she deals with it? How does the school deal with it? How do her teachers deal with it?
Yeah.
How does she feel, you know, in those situations when it's difficult for her to communicate or understand cues from other people?
Well, everything you just said, those are the conversations that I have with the writers. And, you know, I discuss it. And I do have some stories where we're hoping to bring that out. But right now, I am really working hard on having Scarlett be the the ambassador on kindness and inclusion. When I was in the Philippines speaking, in the audience, people were continually asking me, when are we going to see ourselves? Someone had mentioned they had seen a story about Philippines, but I think they're really saying, we want to see us. So as an editor, I said, you know, I have a new character. And Scarlet is going to be from the Philippines. And so her intellectual property is growing and growing. And just from that comment, it even grew further. Her father is from Ireland, and her mother is from the Philippines. And what happened there was more noise coming out on people banning plastic straws. Now, plastic straws are important for some populations that are having medical issues, so I'm sensitive to that. But when I was thinking about Scarlet, building on that idea, I had to give her a last name, and I thought, why don't I look for a beautiful place on this planet? And I happened to come across one, and it happens to be in Ireland. So her last name is Saltee because of the beautiful Saltee Island in Ireland. And then I find out the Filipino people have this cultural mix where this gentleman came up to me. He says, I am from Ireland and my wife is from the Philippines. So I thought that was another thing to put into Scarletts IP. So I changed her look. I upped her skin tone, and her eyes look more culturally connected to the Philippine people.
Well, we're just about out of time. And before we go, I wanted you to tell us about some of the things that, some of the branding that Archie Comics has done. Because now I see games like Monopoly and clothing for Riverdale and Archie. What are some of the things, if you can tell me in like 30 seconds, what are the things that, there's an app, is there an app, is that correct?
Yes, we have an app. You can get Archie Comics digitally, or you can get it in the mail. You can go to a checkout counter. So it's all over, but the branding is phenomenal. Hot Topic is carrying a lot of our items, and if you just go online, you'll find many, many things. I'm, eyeing up some things for, I have an Archie memorabilia collection, so I'm thinking about starting to introduce some of those new licensed projects out there. Okay,
so before we go, I want you to take 10 seconds and tell us about the comic fair that's coming to the Galleria.
Yes.
Is that free?
Yes, we are having the Comic Fest. We are going on, I think it's our fifth year, and it's going to be at the Galleria on April 27th, 2019, and I will be there, Archie Comics will be there, Scarlet will be there, and many other vendors. So you can, speak to artists, graphic artists and graphic writers. So please come, please come.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for being on the show. We appreciate your time. We'd love to have you come back again. Thank you for watching, and good night.